All right. Got to ask me the question.
Yeah. So the second nugget I think that I was hearing when you were telling the story about your your work ethic in many ways was you were raising kids with mom, you were working during the day, and you were going to school at night.
All right.
How was that?
Well, it was busy times, obviously, um, and it had its problems because your mother had never learned to drive. So as a result, when there was a kid emergency, uh, either I had to somehow get home, and or we had the benefit of some nice neighbors at the time, young couples like ourselves, and that lived close by, so they could help your mom out in a child emergency, which you always have, right, with 3 40-year-olds,
Yeah.
etc. Um, but it was the after effect of doing it all, because when I would go to later, when I go to get a job, and people would look at my resume and they saw all of the things I had accomplished, going to school, having kids, and having a job, that became impressive, and so it gave me a leg up, I think, in job interviews a lot of times.
Wow, that's great.
And also, I think through school, I met other students working for companies, and you'd get to talking to them, and you'd think, gee, I wouldn't mind working for that company. And so that did result in me doing a couple of job changes along the way. That, but it kept leading me into the computer business, and on the sidelines, not the main computer. Was that didn't come till later. The the I worked for companies that made equipment to make memories for computers, and it's thinking of today what a memory looks like, and thinking of what the memory were then. It was uh, tremendously different.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So
Were you passionate about business or were you passionate about engineering and technology?
I guess early on it was probably technology and engineering, with the scope of the things that we were able to do. When I first started, uh, computers used things called tubes in them, and I don't have a way of comparing that to anything that you use today. But I mean, the radios had tubes in them, televisions had these electric tubes in them, and so forth. And so did the computers. And the tubes had heaters in them to heat the gas up inside the tube to make it work. And they had so much heat generated by the tubes that they had to have air cooling, and we didn't have as efficient air conditioning as they have today,
Mm.
or and so they would have to have water towers. They would use water coolant, and they'd cool the water on the roof of the building in the big tanks, and then run it down through pipes and through the computer and up to the roof again to dispense the heat that it picked up. So these things were monsters
Mm.
in size. So the first one that I got to work on uh, was a non tube computer. It was revolutionary in the sense that
Mm.
they never hadn't done this before.
Would
So
that be digital logic at that point?
it was, yeah,
God.
Well, even the tubes were digital in a sense. I mean,
Okay.
it was all ones and zeros,
Mm.
and but uh, but the doing away with the tubes made the thing much more compact, and so we were able to develop this computer that basically didn't need any coolant.
Mm.
It, the memory in it turned out to be a thing they call a drum, but and it looked like a drum that they could put recordings on it,
Mm.
ones and zeros, because that's all you stored.
Wow. So when you think back, like you were in the pioneering stages of the digital
Right.
revolution. What do you think about, if you think about today, what do you think about like artificial intelligence and like where we're at today from where we came? Is it just crazy to think?
Well, Mike, I guess I'm not up to date on artificial intelligence, and so I'm kind of trying to learn what it is that it does. I see some things that's scary when you can say to something, write me a paper on this or that, and this machine will generate you a whole long document about it that wasn't the person doing it. That, in other words, they didn't go read a book uh, or research something to find out how to do this. They just went on the fact that a computer can do it for you
Mm.
today. So that's strange and different. I don't know.
That's fascinating. It just made me think about something. As I think you've always been like a lifelong learner, and I was before you said that, I was actually gonna ask you the question: what skill are you working to improve on right now?
just just trying to remember things. I'm afraid my memory is slipping. In the short term, it's pretty damn good on the long term, but up close it gets forgetful.
Got it. Got it. Well, it's pretty impressive for 91.
Well, thank you.
So I think you probably have the Medal of Honor for Grandpa of the last 20 years. When I think of 20 years, just the last 20 years, you've been delivering birthday cards on a consistent basis that I can't even, it's probably more on par with the U.S. mail and how you deliver. Tell me how you do that. Like, what started that for you? How do you do that? How many letters are going out a month? And
Well,
throw some numbers at me.
I inherited this job from your mother, who was the quintessential writer and communicator throughout her life. She had more pen pals that went on for 30 and 40 years. I've lost track of people, and yet she managed to maintain that contacts. So she was the one that started the cards to the kids, of course, and so after she passed away, I felt that I should pick up the mantle and carry it. So she had a book of dates, and I still use that book to look each month and say, okay, whose birthday's coming, and make the necessary trip and go buy the cards.
It's a incredible operational machine
Well,
you have going.
I mean, I have 21 grandkids and great grandkids combined, and then I got a few my sister, and then I've got my in-laws that are still with us.
So I'm gonna switch gears a little bit, and I'll start with like the question I was gonna ask you is, what is the best lesson your father ever taught you? But I'm gonna tell you what the best lesson you ever taught me. Kind of just start with that to give an example. For me, it was similar to your experience of I learned from you. You pointed me towards Southwestern College, which was a very prominent community college in the space of digital tech and mainframes. And you pointed me in that direction, which I was kind of forever be grateful. But I think I learned from you, going to school at night, working during the day, was probably the best lesson I've gotten from you to me. Now, if I ask that question to you, what would you say would be the best lesson maybe you got from your father?
My dad, well, my dad was the middle of three brothers that lived in Philadelphia. Most of he was one of, I think, 11 kids. Most of them died at what today we would say is very young ages. They would die in their 40s, 30s or 40s, and so anyway, he was he would come to well, we didn't have a car. We used public transit, which was great in Philadelphia. And his brothers were married. One lived in West Philly, and the other one lived in close by in Germantown. The one in Germantown had three daughters, though two of them were close to my age. One of them was born about the time of the war. The other one had a son and two daughters. Interesting enough, that brother was the gardener for the estate of the Cardinal of Philadelphia. And so he lived in what they used to call a gatehouse. It was back in the days of horse-drawn carriages would come in through this gatehouse and so forth. So this was the guy that was the gatekeeper to decide who got in, who didn't anyway. So my dad maintained contact with these two brothers. And so he would gather me up and say, "Come, we'll go visit Michael, or we'll go visit James." And we'd go. And I think from that I learned, family was important to him, and it became important to me to maintain that relationship. And it's I have six children, and it's important to me that they all maintain contact with each other and good worry about each other and protect each other in any way they can.
Wow, that's powerful. Now, what about your mom?
Mm.
I remember a story of your mom taking your marbles. You played marbles and she used them for the plants.
Yeah.
I always thought that was funny. Like, tell me something like how some stories with you and your mom.
Well, you got to understand the plant first.
Yeah.
The pot. It was made out of clay, and there's probably still some of them around you see these days. But the pot had a hole in the bottom of it, so that when you put water in, the excess water could drain out. Well, my mother found that if you put a marble in the hole, it would lessen the amount of water that went out, and so forth. So that became the stealing of the marble. And of course, marbles were important, because you played a game in the dirt with marbles, shooting them, and some of them were your best shooters. And So, this was dangerous territory anyway. Yeah.
Problematic. That was your currency, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
What about like the movies? You remember going to the movies as you were a kid? And
Oh yeah.
was it
Oh yeah.
how much did
Ritual.
that cost?
Oh, oh. And Saturday was the big day to go to the movie for me and most kids. And the movies were geared for that. They would have um, a series of things, trailers. They would have cartoons. They would have the newsreels. Then they would have coming attractions, and then the movie. And generally there'd be two movies during the afternoon. One would be a serial, uh, just like in television is today. This was a movie that would go on for weeks, and you would just see a chapter of it in a given week, and then next week you'd have to come back because there was still more to go, type thing. And generally, they were cowboys and Indian kind of shows, and then there was some kind of a serial, regular show you would see. The movie at the time cost 10 cents to go to, and then for a penny, you could get some out of a machine. You could put a penny in, and it would give you a handful of peanuts.
Wow.
And you could get Redskin or the traditional white peanut or whatever. So yes.
Wow. Okay. Now, what do you remember about the houses you lived in as a kid, and which one did you like the best?
Well, unlike you people, I didn't move.
You people.
Uh, I I was born on when I was born, we lived on Montana Street, uh, and there I'm not sure. That's where I was born on, and listed on my birth certificate, 87 East Montana Street, Philadelphia. Um, I don't know when they moved in there. Was it because at the time they were working up for a couple out in the main line of Philadelphia, and my mom was the nanny and my dad was the chauffeur. Um, so I don't know when things changed or diverged, but my dad changed employers. He went to work for a family. Went to work for two women, sisters. One had been married, the other one hadn't. Um, the one that was married a man by the name of Skull, uh, and he and his family owned a coffee company. So anyway, uh, when I became when my memory comes into phase, I remember a couple of things. I remember us living in a house on Johnson Street, which was very near the apartment house where the two women lived in. Was kind of like up the street. Um, and then I remember that because that's where Peggy was born. And at the time, women went to the hospital to have babies. They stayed for 2 weeks. They didn't let them go home. And so I ended up being, because my dad had to work, I ended up staying with my mother's uncle and aunt, and they had two daughters. And so I stayed, and a son, and I stayed with them for the 2 weeks. So I remember being brought home from that and meeting up with Peggy being brought home from the hospital, etc., on that house on Johnson Street. Then, somehow we got from there back to Montana Street. And these were all rentals. And so they rented a house at 71 East Montana Street. And that's where I went from then till I went in the Navy at 17 years of age. So that was from around 5-ish to 17. At the time, we had other kids living on the street, but I had a friend up the street, Jim McFarland, and Jimmy and I were, joined at the hip. He had no siblings. I had Peggy, and so forth. And he was older than me by a year. So he got lined up to go to first grade. There was no kindergarten, no preschool, none of that stuff. You just started first grade when you were 6. Well, Jim was starting first grade, and I was only 5 and a half. And so my mother went down to talk to the nuns. This was a Catholic school. And my mother went down and talked to the nuns about letting me come to first grade with Jim, because I was heartbroken, and so forth. So the nun agreed to take me in, but on the understanding that I probably wouldn't get promoted, that I would probably get left behind. And so my mother said, I don't care, let's make it happen. So I started first grade, and in those days, you went in first grade you went to confession for the first time. You made your first communion at the time, and so when it came time for that to happen, they didn't let me do that. They kept me back from it. I was too young or whatever. Of course, by then I had turned to be 6. And so at the end of the school year, I got promoted.
Oh.
And I kept getting promoted. I never got left down.
I was not expecting to hear that.
Yeah, so then the second grade, then I got to make my first communion and my first confession with the first graders. Mm-hmm. So the nuns made it all happen. That was
caught up.
And then in 3rd and 4th grade they had confirmation. They do 2 classes at a time.
That's early.
And all that's changed, but yeah.
Wow. Well,
anyway, Montana Street was a great street. Yeah.
Longest run too.
Yeah, longest run. We had a lot of the older young men joined the military during the war. I mean, the son of the man next to us on one side, his son was in the Army. The other one had a son in the Army, and etc. So yeah. And the man living next to me, it was a retired police officer who had gotten shot in the leg and lost his leg with the police. So
wow. So you, how old were you when you lost your mom and your dad? And was it
The way you were apart.
relatively close? Okay.
Yeah.
You were out. You were out of the Navy at that point.
Oh, yeah. Actually, Mark had, Tom had been born in 55, Terry in 58, Mark in March of 59. And at the time, my dad was working for a family that went to Texas every winter. She owned, she was a very wealthy woman and owned a big ranch in Texas. The ranch is